Thanks very much, Anita, for that absolutely fascinating insight. We'll have questions, as I say, at the end, and I'm sure there will be lots from yourselves. That case you presented, Anita, reminds me of some of the final anaesthetic and ICU cases that you get where there's never a right answer, whichever way you look, they're like, oh, but... So thanks for that. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been to manage her. So moving on. Now going to introduce our next speakers. Really pleased to have them here, and again, friends of the work that has been carried out in Yorkshire and Humber for a long time. Tony Kelly and also Hannah Rutter. Tony's National Specialty Advisor for Maternity and Neonatal Programme in the NHSE. He's been working at this national level since about 2016. He's led programmes that cover development of new national MEWS, national perinatal culture, leadership programme and development of version 3 of the Saving Babies' Lives Care Bundle. He's passionate about quality improvement and has led on that at a regional and national level. And he is a clinician at heart. He continues to work as a consultant in obstetrics and gynecology, University Hospitals Brighton and Sussex, where he's been since 2003 and has a real interest in high-risk intrapartum care. We've also got Hannah, really pleased to have Hannah here with us as well. Hannah's been working for the NHS for 25 years, started as a registered nurse and then moved into midwifery. She's got broad clinical experience but a real passion around about patient safety in perinatal care, and currently is QI lead for the perinatal deterioration in maternity and neonatal programme. She has also recently completed an MEaCC in patient safety, and understandably this has enabled her to expand knowledge and bring some insight to her current work. So put your hands together please for Tony and Hannah. Thank you.
You want this?
Is it just connected on, is it? Yes. Yeah, so I think you're probably just moving on. I think it's all.
Okie dokie. Right. Hello. Firstly, an apology. You'll all be thinking I'm just going to say I've got man flu. I just have a bad cold, so the croaky voice, coughing and sneezing is me just trying to be a hero by still being here. Can I just ask, to begin with, who we've got in the room, just so we know how we can pitch this? So, midwives? Obstetricians? You know, you're being a bit shy. Put your hands higher. I can't see how many we've got. Okay. Anaesthetists? Okay. And who else? A what? Wow. Okay. Some nurses. Oh, outreach, brilliant. Okay, so good mixture. Good. Okay, so as you've heard from the slightly embarrassing bios for both of us, we work for NHS England and have been predominantly working on this piece of work around a new national maternity early warning school. What we're going to sort of walk you through over the next half an hour is a little bit of the story as to where we've come from and where we're going to, and a little bit of what the future looks like. And hopefully you'll see how what we're going to talk about meshes very well with the pieces of work that you've heard Debbie speaking about earlier, but also some of the problems that Anita has been highlighting in her presentation in the last half hour. But this stuff's really hard. You know, there's no way around this. This is difficult. Embrace has been saying the same thing over and over and over again for over the last 15 years. So if it was easy, we would have sorted it. So it is difficult. But we can make it slightly easier by making the processes more streamlined. We don't have all the answers, that's the spoiler alert, but what we do have is some suggestions and ways in which we can do this better. We're not going to tell you that you have to do everything the way that we think. What we are going to say is this is the way we're all going to try and do it for the now, and then, you know, learn our way into the space. Might sound a bit weird for national ideology, but that's what we think is the best way forward. Deterioration continues to be an issue. You haven't got to look further than Embrace or Each Baby Counts or now MNSI and various reports that we've had from Shrewsbury and Telford and from East Kent. Deterioration is something that comes up time and time again. And for some of you who are anaesthetists, who are working in outreach teams, this is not just a problem for obstetrics. You know, Martha's rule is coming in for a reason, because we're not very good at managing this. And part of it is because we don't communicate very well. Part of it is because we're not very good at identifying the problem in a timely way. And sometimes that communication can be about risk, but other times it can be much more culturally based. And from a pregnancy point of view, it becomes quite problematic, because when our women and birthing people are unwell, they're not always on the labour ward. So actually they're being looked after by groups and teams who wouldn't necessarily see a pregnant woman every day of the week and won't be aware that her physiology shifts quite a lot. But part of the problem that we have in this space is that we go about trying to fix the wrong thing. So Hannah and I have both spent a lot of time working in quality improvement as well as safety over the last sort of 10 years. I use this sticker quite a lot. Those of you who spend a lot of time on motorways, as I do, will be used to seeing this above the sinks in many motorway service stations. But they spend a lot of time putting this sticker there, but they don't seem to invest in time making sure that the water coming out the tap is the right temperature. And that's what we do in the NHS quite a lot. We find stickers to put over problems rather than actually getting to the base of what the issue is. So we need to fix the right thing. We need to understand the impact that culture has on the way that we manage deterioration, because it is huge and certainly cannot be worked around. We need to be able to sort of tackle it a little bit more than we are at the moment. And what we do need, and Marion Knight at Embrace has been saying this quite a lot, is we do need a national standard tool and pathway for managing deterioration in the pregnant woman, which I think we've done. So, what do you need? Well, you need something that's timely. You need something that responds and gives you information at the right point. Now, this is going to get a little bit scientific now, so do stay with me. So this graph, wellness on the y-axis, time on the x-axis, and you'll see the green line there is for when somebody is well, okay? Science, not too much so far. And then this is, the red line is when you're not so well, okay? So the gap between the two is the deterioration space that we're talking about. And that's really where these tools should be operating. And what we're trying to do is get to these women at a point where actually we can bring them back up to being well relatively quickly. Joking aside, the earlier we get to them, the less they need rescuing and the less impact it's going to have on their subsequent well-being. So although you might have a woman who ends up with a 7-litre postpartum hemorrhage and is actually alive at the end of it, the impact on her life for the next 3 to 4 months is going to be quite significant. And a lot of the time that morbidity is avoidable if we were to actually act in an appropriate way soon enough. So one of the words I really want you to take away from today is try and focus on the word early, because that's what this tool is designed to do, is to try and give you signals that the physiology that this woman is displaying is not normal. That doesn't mean that you need to treat it. It means you need to be mindful of it and monitor it and think about whether something needs to be done. So it's not a late warning score and it's not a treatment tool, it's an early warning score. And that word is really important, because what we're trying to do is to get upstream of these problems and actually in many ways predict when they actually might happen. And that's difficult because a lot of the tools that are out there don't do this very well. Now, we're going to focus predominantly on this centre bit of this at the moment, so we're going to think about identification. But actually, when we try and talk about deterioration, we try and think about 4 elements. So are there bits of this that we can be aware of, predict, prevent even? And then as Debbie was sort of presenting on earlier, the way we respond to escalation and deterioration is equally very important, because it can make the pathway of care better. But we're predominantly going to sit in this I for identification space, certainly for the next 20 minutes. This slide tries to illustrate the scale of the issue that we had before we started the work that we've been doing for the last 3 years? 4? Jesus, okay, time flies. It tries to show you the range of normal and abnormal ranges for heart rate, oxygen saturations and temperature on some early warning score tools that were out there. We reckon there was probably close to 60 different tools at one point, none of which are based on anything other than consensus and some sense of thinking about, well, actually, we don't want to treat that woman, so let's not make her blood pressure abnormal until it reaches that point. What we've done, I say we're a big group, Debbie was part of it, Anita was part of it, a number of other very clever, learned people who've done lots of research in this area were part of it, developed a tool that's based on population data. So these 6 observations are basically, you have 2 degrees of variation of abnormal or normal, 6 observations, total score of 0 to 12. And this is based on population data. So these cut-off points are based on centiles for what pregnant women, those observations look like in normal and therefore abnormal pregnancy. So they're not based on treatment of systolic blood pressure at 160 according to NICE. It's saying that if your blood pressure, systolic blood pressure is over 145, that puts you outside of 99% of the pregnant population. So that's not normal. Now, it doesn't mean you necessarily have to act on it and treat it, but you have to make sure that somebody, or you and other people, are aware of the fact that that's moving in the wrong direction. And the way that we did this is we did some modelling. So we took the Scottish early warning score tool and the Irish one and a few other cut-offs and looked at some modelling as to how this tool would perform against these data, and actually have published this now. This came out in BMJ Medicine early this year. So we've actually got a sort of a set of population data and an academic process that's allowed us to deliver this, this new tool that we're using. So it's not just based on consensus or ideology. But one of the things that's in the tool, which I think for me is particularly appealing, is if you've got abnormal physiology, then that gives you the sort of the sense of the reason to escalate. What we've tried to avoid is adding too many things into that score. So a lot of the tools that are out there may add in the fact that the woman has a reduced urine output, or it may add in that she has developed vaginal bleeding, and those elements score alongside the physiology. Or they may substitute out something. I mean, there's a whole, I don't even know what that bottom one is. I just found it on the internet, but it looked quite interesting. So you can make this so complicated that what you end up doing is diminishing the value of the physiology. And what you want this to be about is the physiology. That's what scores, because that's what tells you whether something is normal or abnormal. That's not to say the other things aren't important. And what we've done is we've tried to keep this simple. So it's not rocket science, a subtle clue there with the slide. Physiology, and then we add in what we've deemed as being additional concerns. So if you think this woman herself looks unwell, if she tells you she doesn't feel very well, if she suddenly drops 200 mils of blood on the bed, or a pain threshold, a pain score is going up markedly, those are things that would worry us as clinicians. And in addition to the score that she's got from the physiology, can change the way that we would manage that case. So we don't ignore it, but we don't put it in the score because we want the score to tell us whether the physiology is normal or abnormal. And that then allows us to get to this point. And in many of the other tools that are out there that you may be familiar with in your own hospitals, you have this colour-based system for escalation. So if you have 2 yellow or 1 red, you then escalate. So it's either don't escalate or do escalate. By using a numeric score in the way that we have, what you're able to do is to graduate the degree of concern that you have about that woman. And that allows you to get somebody to come and see her quicker, the sicker that she is. It also allows you to get more senior and a wider group of people to come and review her, the sicker that she is. But equally, if you get to this point and her, let's say the physiology only gives you a score of 1, but actually she's in a lot of pain and she's bleeding and you're really worried about her, you're not going to ignore those. What you're then going to do is go, actually, I'm going to increase the level of concern I've got and I'm going to make sure somebody comes and sees her. So you're bringing in that holistic review of her and the concerns that you may have into this process. So it becomes a conversation. And that's where the culture is obviously key in the way that we manage this. But one of the things that I think makes this process, we feel, important and slightly unique is this tool will follow that woman wherever she is looked after. So it doesn't matter whether she's in a maternity unit, in a triage, whether she's on an intensive care unit or in an enhanced care setting on her labour ward, that tool will follow her. We've been working with the Ambulance Trust, and they've just released a new toolkit which will bring together the physiology that we have used alongside the way that they will look at more of a situational, clinical situation review. So if the woman is bleeding and they look at her physiology. So we're trying to combine that, and we're already starting to look at how we can use this tool and process in the community, in midwifery-led units, to understand how we might need to flex the escalation process. But at the heart of all of this, the woman's physiology when she's pregnant will be the thing that will be reflected in all of those places. I'll not tell you the difficult stuff now.
We very much chop this up because with different skill sets, Tony's very good at the science. I'm a little bit better at explaining how we got to where we got to, which is it's missing.
The well-worn one.
The well-worn one. I was really conscious that when we were putting this slide deck together that actually we hadn't come to the Yorks and Humber area to discuss the sort of development of the MEWS but also the NEWT 2, mainly because we've actually had to focus in sort of areas whereby there was going to be paper implementation, and I just thought it was actually really important to come and explain to you the process that we've gone through, because what I would hate for anyone to take away is that we actually just put our finger in the air and went, oh, that's a really good idea, look, that looks really pretty, that might work. So just wanted to come and just explain sort of like the process of the last few years, and hope that would just sort of like build a little bit of confidence in the process that we've gone through when you actually move into what hopefully will be a digital implementation within the next sort of 6 to 12 months. I can't actually see the back of that room. I'm getting old. I do apologise, but I think I know the slides well enough. So back in the year 2020, we came together to sort of like think about how we could bring this together, and we actually formed a really representative core design group, and Tony's already explained that Debbie and Nita were part of that representative group. And actually we really needed some guidance through that, but what we also wanted to achieve at the end of this is actually something that's user-friendly, and by user-friendly I mean for our clinical teams on the in the hospitals that would be able to actually use this. So it was really important that we took a number of clinical teams on this journey with us. So we phased this up, as we like to do. We've got phased, goodness knows whatever number we're on now, but we're when we went back to the improvement cycles, we really wanted to understand that this was going to work. So we actually did a couple of sort of phases. We weren't able to go live because of sort of obvious governance constraints, etc. But we really wanted to try and sort of understand, the usage. So we did lots of desktop exercises with some of our clinical teams, so looking back on old notes and actually utilising the national MEWS against some of the old sort of historical cases that they'd had, so that we could actually work out whether what was on paper was going to work, whether the boxes were the right size, whether actually we were going to lose anything if we put holes into a piece of paper, for instance, which sounds really silly, but is really important if you're going to lose some clinical context from any of the forms that you're using. But then also wanting to understand what that worked like alongside in our maternity units. So thinking about, which I know, massive kudos to the teams that took part in this, but actually almost double scoring, but actually just understanding, does this work? Does this actually feel right? What sort of care setting is this going to be problematic for us? Is it going to be problematic in any of the care settings? So going through our PDSA cycles quite continuously, we came up with what is actually now the national MEWS, and has been signed off by a number of people, just as actually this is, been through a really robust process. We are where we are. It gets a little bit more exciting, I promise you, because the digital journey is interesting. So just a little slide just to evidence that, we didn't just go with the minimum numbers. We really wanted to reach as many people as we possibly could, and just to understand that all of the components within the tool work. So not just the physiology, but actually were the additional concerns understood? Was it understood how they added value to any sort of like levels of concern, and actually how the clinical teams could then move forward with their escalation? Talking about phasing, I worked out how many loads of little things in the PowerPoints that you can make into little pretty pictures. So we are now in, as you can see, sort of phase 5 and phase 6 of the process. So we went live with National MEWS probably about 15 months ago into some of our Pathfinder organisations. So those organisations are ones that hadn't actually yet achieved their digital transition and actually were really keen to move forward with the National Maternity Early Warning Score. So we've been able to really support those organisations. We're now live in 30 across the country, so actually I've been able to get some really useful information from those Pathfinder sites. The phases that we're in at the moment have been quite tricky, and I just need to just double check what my next slide is so I don't repeat myself. So we have got to a point where we are ready to launch our digital specification. We're just waiting for those final sign-offs because actually there's some sort of information within those that Tony and I probably don't understand. It's really, really technical. Then we'll be able to sort of like publish that. So there is actually a national standard then so that you can move forward with implementation in the digital systems to, hopefully continue with that standardised approach across the country. I will talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides' time, but what I did want to evidence at this point is that we have actually been able to learn from our Pathfinder organisations and actually been able to then sort of move forward with implementation plans for our digital services. We're able to take some of that feedback and actually really think through how we can support implementation further. And one of the key things that came out of a recent shared learning event that we held for our Pathfinder sites was the tool had really empowered our clinical teams to raise concerns and to escalate further. So within the MEWS, I'm sure that you saw on the slide that Tony showed that there's actually a secondary escalation point. So if you feel like your escalation is not being heard or there's other things going on in the maternity unit that you're working in, actually it's giving almost permission, so empowering healthcare professionals to raise their level of concern to actually get appropriate people to review their women. The additional concerns are really adding value. So sometimes for all of our clinicians in the room, you are actually sometimes saying there's something wrong, can't quite put my finger on it. The physiology is telling you that everything is okay, but there's just something that you can't actually pinpoint. The additional concerns that are within the MEWS tool have really sort of given sort of strength to that further escalation, actually being able to say, well, actually I'm concerned and the woman's concerned. The physiology and the sort of score is actually a total of 1 at the moment, but actually can we make a plan to continuously review this one because there's just something not quite right. I'm going to turn around because I can't read that far. I think that's all covered it really. But the yellow boxes are the things that we actually really had sort of fed back to us that we need to think a little bit further about. So thinking about personalisation of care and actually maternal inequalities and actually how we can sort of start thinking about how we address those through the deterioration work stream, but also the community and standalone birth settings. I think that when we say that the MEWS tool is from conception until 4 weeks postnatal, that actually sort of rolls off the tongue really easily. But then when you think about the different complexities in organisations and primary care, etc., how we actually do that is just mind-blowing. So our next sort of phase of work is going to be thinking about how we support escalation and total scoring for our community midwifery colleagues and also our standalone birth centres. So actually one of my pleas as part of this today is if there's someone that would be really interested in your organisation to come forward and come as part of our working group to think that through, please contact myself and we'll add you to that list. And we just want to make sure that we hear that from the reality of what those teams experience out in the community and in the standalone birth centres to inform actually how we support that moving forward. So how we're implementing the tools, how we've done this so far, we've worked really closely with our colleagues at Health Education England, and actually there are 2 modules on that platform, and that is for the National MEWS, but also the newborn early warning track and trigger tools as well. I'm just going to move into the next slide, because this is what we have really been working with when we've been discussing with our teams. More than happy to come and do one of these sessions with any of your organisations that want to listen to about some of the considerations for implementation, thinking about sort of organisational readiness and what your local leadership looks like, making sure there's an MDT approach to the implementation. We've had varying degrees of teams come to us with, sometimes it's sort of like the postnatal ward manager and the labour ward coordinator wanting to implement this, but actually there's not been as much drive from sort of like senior management within the organisation, whereas we've had some meetings that we've turned up to and there's been 20 plus really engaged multidisciplinary teams wanting to all ensure that this is done appropriately. I'm not saying that either of those are right or wrong. It was just, I think the one thing that we've learned really and heard really quite loudly is that there needs to be a multi-professional approach to implementation, because it touches so many of the areas within maternity. Staff readiness as well, thinking about what that training looks like within your organisation, what you think would be right and proper. Thinking about the acute maternity settings, but some organisations have really wanted to move forward really rapidly into all care settings, and I think for some that depends on whether, with their digital footprints, what that looks like for them, whether they're an enterprise EPR or whether they're actually sort of like the myriad of digital platforms. The clinical governance and guidelines, so thinking about also amalgamation of existing guidelines within your organisation, but also thinking about other areas that need to be considered. And we've worked really closely with the BSOTS team to align their TAC cards to make sure that that's referencing the National MEWS total score. So there's actually some sort of quite significant work that's gone on in the background that we can sort of support you with when we move into implementation. Measurement's really tricky. We're thinking about sort of like higher level measurement at the moment. I know that obviously being here today at the MEaCC Day is thinking about how we measure that enhanced care, but also thinking about what successful implementation looks like, and actually thinking about escalation and thinking about time to escalation and time to response, and actually thinking about, is there any areas that as a national team we could be aware of so that we can actually start putting a little bit more thought into. And actually the resources, there's a resource slide at the end that will have all of the sort of podcast links, etc., for you to tap into. I'm going to speed along because I'm probably talking far too much, but thinking about when we moved into this space, we only had a 45% digital capture across the country. Post-pandemic, that has increased significantly, and at 85% of organisations are actually a fully digital capture. So you can imagine that's actually been quite challenging to work around. Oh, my numbers are wrong on the slide. We are 30 live with MEWS at the moment, and 26 live with NEWT2. We have actually been able to provide some significant support to those areas, but that is going to really inform how we move forward with our implementation plans for the digital world. And talking about the digital world, that has been probably the most complex part of any of this work. It has been a real challenge because we are working in a different world whereby you actually have to communicate with our commercial colleagues, and it's business. And I think that sometimes in the NHS we forget that there's business, because I think we're always in there for, we want patient care to be safe, we want patient care to be good, and for outcomes to be positive. And I think that it was quite a new world to enter into when we're entering into sort of those commercial sensitivities. But we are moving. We have got a digital specification now that will be published hopefully within the next few weeks. And I know we've been having sort of like more local conversations with some of your organisations. So watch this space for that. And just to sort of like evidence that we've also thought about our clinical use within this design. So it hasn't been about just sort of transitioning the paper tool to the digital specification. It's thinking about different things like the interoperability and actually what digital can do that's much better than actually documenting, for instance, on a paper version. Our end user is really important in this. Our end user is our clinical teams. We want to ensure through this process that it was going to work. It wasn't that we wanted to just be like, right, here you go, that's written in stone. We wanted to really take people through again, that journey using sort of an improvement lens. So we've engaged with a number of clinical colleagues across the country to gain their feedback on the specifications and how that's going to inform as we move forward, especially into implementation. I'm going to hand back over to you.
Mr. and Mrs. Blind here. Luckily, I've got my glasses on me. But measurement, just to finish off a couple of points before we close. This is really hard because it's actually very difficult to understand whether what we're trying to do is making a difference. And it's very hard to be measuring something that doesn't happen very often, or to see a reduction in something that doesn't happen very often. Particularly when we're talking about some of these conditions that women die from, and as Anita showed you, those numbers are relatively small, but still very significant. So there's a lot of work at the moment, and the dreamed logo there is a study that's NIHR funded, being led by Marion Knight. Anita and I are part of that study as well, looking, basically validating and evaluating this new tool, but also trying to develop a little bit more of a nuanced morbidity and mortality outcome for these women, so we can understand, apart from whether we notice that there's a problem, whether we respond in a timely fashion, does it actually affect outcome? Because actually, otherwise it's quite difficult to do. So that's a piece of work that's quite challenging, but is moving forward. I think the enhanced care work that Debbie has been leading, we can't underplay how important this is from the point of view of experience of care, if nothing else. You told me some data earlier that 1 in 10 of these women that have gone through this database end up needing enhanced care. So this isn't a small proportion of women. This is a significant proportion of women. But the earlier that we can recognise these women are deteriorating, the likelihood is the less they're going to need to have enhanced care. That's what we're trying to do. Not wait for people to be falling over, but to understand what we could do to prevent that deterioration further. And a lot of this is not just about us sticking a tool out there and just letting it happen, which is why we're here today and why Hannah and I spend a lot of time curating this process, to stop people thinking about the fact that the tool is the answer to the problem. It's a part of the solution, but this goes much, much wider than just identifying a problem. And one of the issues that we can't sidestep and we don't have time to talk about today is how we ensure that these conversations happen without, by taking note of what's going on culturally within these teams. So all of the units across the country have just been, or are still part of, a national culture and leadership programme. And a lot of the deficiencies that you're going to find in those culture surveys will be around how you communicate within teams, how you're able to raise concerns. This tool will allow some of that to be crystallised easier in the sense of understanding what the problem is. But until we start really getting to the root of how we communicate with each other in a way that is both functional and civil, we're never going to crack this problem. So it's something that is, this tool is part of it, but it's not all of it. I think we need to keep this in our eye line all the time, though. The inequalities that we've got in care at the moment are staggeringly bad. And we are failing big groups of women who are having babies, both black and Asian women, but also people who are in areas of social deprivation. And the way in which we manage deterioration will benefit these women because we will be able to recognise the problems with their care better, but it won't be the full solution either. So we've also got to be thinking about how we're structuring our care to ensure that we aren't doing this, that the way that we're improving care doesn't actually just advantage some but disadvantage others. And I'm not saying I know the answer to this, but a lot of the work that we're doing at the moment in trying to develop the next stage of our work in NHS England is very much focusing on these groups. But context, I think, is really important because, as I said right at the beginning, this is hard. And it's hard because it's difficult work to do, but it's hard because you're already doing 20 other things that you're being asked to do. You're doing it in a context where you're all very tired, where we've got workforce and rota gaps in all of our parts of our service, and actually everyone's really feeling the strain of doing this. And so actually it can be difficult because you don't get a break for 9 hours, and actually trying to keep an eye on how that one of the 3 women that you're looking after on labour ward is getting on becomes really difficult. So doing improvement when the system is running this hot is really difficult. But actually, hopefully, what this will allow us to do is to work smarter rather than just harder. But I wouldn't want to ignore the fact that you're all really doing an amazing job as it is. We've done 3 podcasts, which you can get through the NHS website, which explain a little bit about how we got to where we've got to. Anita's on one of them with us, talking through various parts. They're, apart from having to listen to me drone on for quite a lot of them, they're quite good to listen to. The e-learning for health resources are there. The BMJ paper we mentioned is also there. And if you want to get in touch, our web email addresses are there, and we'd be happy to hear from you. But thanks very much for listening.